The brain sees what it wants to see. That is the philosophy Philip Goodman, the protagonist of the 2018 horror movie Ghost Stories, puts forward to the viewer and leads his life by. Now, if that's true, your brain is currently seeing a skeleton on the internet analyse horror movies. So I don't know what that says about you, mate. You might just be in the head, to be honest. Directed and written by Jeremy Dyson, as well as its lead star Andy Nyman, Ghost Stories is a British horror anthology film that originally started its life as a stage play by the pair. A throwback to the classic British ghost stories of old, the film follows Andy in the role of Philip, a skeptic TV presenter whose show carries out investigations against the likes of fraudulent psychic mediums, exposing the tricks they use to take advantage of vulnerable people. He got into the business of unravelling the mysteries behind the supposedly supernatural through his hero Charles Cameron, a paranormal investigator famous in the 1970s who had inspired him as a young boy. A man who could find the logic behind any mystery, only to then become one himself after he went inexplicably missing with no trace. One day, Philip gets a letter from the missing Charles inviting him for an encounter. The strange possibility of this being his disappeared hero is too enticing to pass up, so he follows the letter's instructions and finds Charles now living in a caravan, alone, sick, and not the academic grounded rationalist that he once was. Gone is the scientific and analytical realist that had inspired Philip so much in his youth. In his place, a spiteful and angry old man who berates Philip's work in a cruel and dismissive manner before offering him a challenge. If Philip truly is as smart as he believes himself to be, if he's correct and that, as Charles had once himself believed, that every instance of the supernatural can be explained away with logic, science and psychology, that it really is just the broken minds of sad souls grasping at the desperate straws of grief in a hope for something to still hold on to, then please explain these 3 cases. 3 cases that Charles had investigated himself. 3 cases that no matter what, even with all of his skills and experience, Charles could simply not prove for the life of him to be anything other than instances of real supernatural occurrences. Occurrences that now prove his and Philip's entire life's work to be nothing more than meaningless, arrogant drivel. Philip nervously goes along with the request, investigating each of the stories one by one, and slowly and reluctantly starts to question his reality before desperately trying to find ways to rationalise it. The first case is the story of a rough around the edges security guard called Tony, a lonely and slightly angry man whose wife died of cancer and whose child suffers from locked-in syndrome, a unique type of coma where a patient is aware of their surroundings but cannot move or speak due to paralysis. Tony tells the story of one night's shift when he was watching over a disused asylum where he had a strange and terrifying encounter with the ghost of a young girl. The second case belongs to a twitchy young man plagued with anxiety called Simon, a teenager who has a pretty unfortunate and unusual home life and an almost disturbed obsession with the occult. He believes that he was approached by a demonic entity one night when his car broke down in the woods as he drove home. The third and final case is that of Mike, a toffee upper-class money man who believed his home to be haunted by a poltergeist while he awaited the birth of his first child. Allegedly, he saw the ghost of his wife moments before finding out she had died in childbirth. Each of the 3 tales sets Philip deeper down a rabbit hole of dark discoveries. The cases eventually begin to bleed out into Philip's reality as more and more strange occurrences begin to populate the wraparound story of his investigations, and not just stay confined to the tales the subjects tell. As the cases develop and Philip's worldview becomes increasingly shattered, Philip will end up confronting some of his own demons and address uncomfortable truths about his past and his place in the world of the paranormal. Ghost Stories was an absolute shocker for me when I saw it. Seeing it in the cinema with a friend and going in completely blind, it had been a good while since I'd found myself absolutely white-knuckling the armrest, but man, I know everybody is different when it comes to what scratches the fight or flight part of your brain, but as someone not particularly scared of most horror movies, this film had my body so tensed up it nearly turned in on itself. Taken just as a straight horror movie without any deeper thought, this film is so effective in creating an absolutely dreadful tension. And although the third investigated case is probably the least scary of the three, which does ramp it down a little, even taking that into account, there is not a single weak tale amongst them, with every one of them delivering a completely different, yet almost just as terrifying an encounter. A total rarity for anthology movies. The scares are assisted by some truly excellent performances of all involved. Paul Whitehouse, an actor more often associated with his comedic roles, absolutely kills it as a terrified Tony. The kind of masculine working class figure who hides his fears and anxieties with a penchant for pints, a distrust of whatever minority the tabloids are telling him to hate that week, and a healthy dollop of toxic masculinity and misogyny. What could be a one-dimensional stereotype is given a lot of life through his ever-flipping mood and moments of terrified vulnerability that bleed out the frightened humanity behind the blokey facade. Alex Lowther as Simon is so tangibly nervous in his role that you can feel his anxiety leak through the screen. His constantly on edge persona makes the audience just as perpetually nervous throughout his sequence as he is, which of course adds to the terror by creating a general feeling of unease and discomfort that sits with you before you even get to the spooky goings on. Martin Freeman as Mike carries himself with a certain degree of traditionally posh respectability that makes him both quite obnoxious but also extremely credible. Where the other encounters could perhaps be written off as the delusions of sad, disturbed and lonely souls, the brain sees what it wants to see after all, Mike is no such thing. He's successful, he's outgoing, he's always in control of the conversation. He seems very much like he'd be the kind of person to scoff at the suggestion of ghosts. A man who would dismiss the mere idea of them as childish buffoonery. So if this guy is scared, then you should be too. And tying them all together is Andy Nyman as Philip, a truly fantastically realised character whose complex relationship with the paranormal is not just a great driving force for the narrative investigations to bleed from, but that also creates a tool with which to conduct a complex character study of a man who, in theory, is a deeply successful figure, righting the wrongs of the world and getting paid to do it in the spirit of his former idol, but whose pursuit of this goal perhaps acts as a coping mechanism for a crippling insecurity and troubled past. While it is fantastically directed, nail-bitingly tense, full of imaginative scares, gives a classic British feel in the vein of the 60s works of Amicus Productions, and is rounded out with a cast of well-realised characters, the thing for me that brings it from a scary piece of work to a spectacular one is the tragic and deeply personal internal conflict that anchors it. Philip as a person is someone who is deeply proud of his skepticism, wearing it as a kind of badge of honour that says, "I am so smart." Rationality and logic are not just the things that keeps a roof over his head, but that also act as a comfort blanket from the parts of the world that frighten him. As a young boy, Philip grew up under the watchful eye of a deeply religious father, one that threw his sister out of their family home for the act of her dating an Asian man. His experiences with his father and the dogmatic nature of such an upbringing found Philip seeking an escape from the difficulties of theology, one he found in the work of Charles Cameron. Here was someone who, through science and logic of all things, could explain away the superstitious, the theistic, the scary. Someone who took the things that Philip was afraid of, that made Philip feel shame and fear and guilt, and like a magic trick, basically made it all disappear. Writing off all of this belief as desperate nonsense put forward as a way to make sense of reality from people who simply could not see the forest for the trees. He gave Philip a line of work to pursue, one that, in his own words, could stop people's lives being ruined and torn apart by the same superstitions that his family was. It's clear that even though that Philip is, at least on paper, pursuing his noble endeavour and succeeding in doing so at a high scale, he's still seemingly a very lonely man. He has no partner of which to speak, we never see him with a friend, it's just him and his work. work that when challenged, he becomes deeply insecure and upset about. Though his worldview might be scientifically backed, for Philip, it is just as much a protective shield from the ills of the world as superstition and religion is to others. And I think that's so interesting to have his rationale framed in such a way. If you were around in the days of the internet when YouTube and Reddit were going through their staunch atheism phase, you'll have no doubt encountered many of the insufferable, patronising and ironically holier-than-thou figures that populated this period. In the days of r-atheism being a default subreddit, there was no shortage of figures not too far off from what Philip is in this film. People who didn't just simply not believe in a higher power, but who treated that lack of belief as a sign of advanced intelligence, approaching any and all beliefs that fell outside of a coldly clinical approach to the world as the creations of an idiot populace ruled by fear who didn't know any better. Obviously, not all atheists are like this, and there is nothing inherently wrong with non-theistic beliefs. I say this myself, after all, as someone who is not spiritual in any capacity, despite literally being a living skeleton. There's a scientific explanation for all of this, I'm sure. But the movement had a lot of big influencers and significant internet presence during this period, and a lot of the worst voices proved to be the loudest. A commonly held attitude for a lot of these people was that religion was a shield from sadness held by stupid people. A pleasant little story individuals told themselves to keep the scary or difficult parts of the world at bay. The idea came from the thought that something like heaven, for example, was nothing more than a pleasant lie told by fools, so they didn't have to worry about the thought of death. Or that because God was watching out for them, they didn't have to take ownership or responsibility for their actions, or worry about the consequences, because they could place all that complex stuff into the hands of a higher power. Ghost Stories as a film really interestingly flips the script on this, asking instead, well, what if the opposite could also be true? What if there are people in the world writing off their beliefs because it's too scary to believe in them? The concept of heaven may be a comfort, but to believe in it comes at the expense of also fearing hell, since if one exists, then so may the other. And you can claim to be brave and clever in acknowledging that you are responsible for your own actions. But could that also be just because it's a terrifying thought to have that you might not be? That you might not be the one in control? Maybe you don't have all the answers, all the solutions. Maybe there are some things in life that are simply unexplainable, unfathomable, unthinkable. And no science or logic or rationalizations will ever find the solutions that will make you comfortable with that reality. It's a really fascinating angle to approach a discussion around beliefs from, one that gives us a profound insight into the deep insecurities of its character at the centre of its narrative. It's a position that also enhances the film's scares, by putting the audience firmly in the perspective of a man who grips so tightly to clinical rationalizations of anything out of the ordinary, someone who on paper isn't scared of anything because he's too smart for that, and knows for a fact there simply isn't anything to be scared of, only to pull the rug out from under him and show that this person, this well-researched, analytical, rational and successful TV presenter is just as capable of falling to that innate instinct of fear when confronted with something difficult, and only afterwards will find retrospective ways to explain the experience, ignoring the parts that don't fit his narrative and clutching at the straws of the elements that can, as if creating a protective fort for his worldview from whatever materials he can get his hands on. It makes the audience see if someone so logical can be scared of this stuff, then maybe we should be too. It effectively asks them to question their own worldview and how they approach that which does not make sense in their lives, showing them a reflection of the kind of loneliness and insecurity that can come with locking yourself off into such a stringent and unmovable belief system, to the point that you can essentially trade one dogma, in Philip's case his religious upbringing, for another, the safety of skepticism. As someone who doesn't believe in this stuff, it's a really intriguing concept. It got me to hypothetically think, what would I actually do if I ever saw a ghost? I mean, if I am so firmly of the belief that I never will, how does that align with my worldview if my reality proves to me otherwise. What would I do in that situation? Would I instantly 180 my entire belief systems I have held all my life in the face of new evidence? Or would I attempt to use my previously established lack of belief to explain this thing away so I don't have to confront that challenge, no matter how real and undeniable my first-hand experience of the contrary might have been? It's impossible to know really, but I find it a deeply compelling thought. Smartly, Ghost Stories explores its narrative in a way that provides no clear stance either way. Though Philip is clearly insecure and uses skepticism as a coping mechanism to deal with an upbringing that proved to be traumatic for him, the movie does offer the possibility that there are in fact potentially valid explanations for everything that's seen on screen. Everything we witness is told to us from the second-hand descriptions of unreliable narrators, and Philip himself would often be included in that count, with elements of his past coming up as the film develops that he wasn't so keen to share with the audience he spoke directly to at the beginning of the film when discussing his childhood. It's a film that gives the audience a lot to think about when it comes to the concept of what makes a worldview and how much you can trust your own beliefs. It just so happens that it manages to do all of that while also wrapping these questions and concepts in the brilliant packaging of a terrifying tale in the style of the stripped back ghostly British classics. Ghost Stories and the character of Philip becomes even more interesting when you realise that the guy playing him and that the co-writer and co-director Andy Nyman has a history in a field similar to Philip's own. Andy having worked at length with psychological illusionist Derren Brown, including co-writing both Seance and Messiah, two TV specials Derren Brown performed that focused on the debunking of practices used to supposedly commune with the dead and expose mediums that claim to have these abilities. This made me curious exactly how much of the themes of this film was something Andy himself had rolled back and forth in his own head during the creation of his previous work, since it was so clear so much of the Philip character's history had likely been informed by his own illustrious career. So I decided to ask him about it. Please welcome to the channel, co-creator of Ghost Stories, Mr. Andy Nyman. So hi Andy, welcome to the channel.
Hi, it's very nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So obviously one of the things with the writing of Philip Goodman, in the film he has a background where he is a sort of debunker TV presenter of, you know, those kind of medium shows and stuff like that. I found obviously that, you know, you've done a lot of work in those types of positions, you know, with Derren Brown and stuff. How much of that were you pulling from for the film, and how much of that is informing the direction your film takes?
Well, you know, there's an awful lot. I am very well versed in that world. It's a fascinating world. And so all of the stuff in the film in that respect is legit. What is also absolutely drenched in the film is the notion of faith, because, you know, Jeremy and I are both Jewish. We met at Jewish summer camp when we were kids. It's remained a very important part of our lives. But one of the things that Ghost Stories digs into, your sense of identity and who you are, and how that your upbringing, and especially within a construct of faith, how you conduct yourself and how your actions impact on other people's lives. And one of the things is, you know, treat others as you wish to be treated. And if you don't, then God help you, because there is a heaven and there is a hell. I'm not saying I believe this, but I'm saying this is part of what the belief system is, and that's part of what is under Ghost Stories as well.
No, I think that's really interesting, actually, because that's something I've kind of talked about in the video. Philip Goodman as a character really wrestles with this idea of approaching everything with this cold logic. What I find interesting is there's a common argument within those communities. Religion is kind of a comfort blanket for people. You guys kind of flip that script back, and without sort of giving a decision either way, without sort of saying like, well, this is right and this is wrong, you sort of use Philip Goodman as a character to say like, well, actually, what if cold logic and approaching everything with this clinical scientific practice is in itself a comfort blanket?
There's no question that's true.
Yeah.
There's no question that's true. You know, the opening of the film, literally the pre-credits, Goodman's father is a bad Jew. It's not a person who's adhering to, not truly, he thinks he is, but he is not truly behaving in a godly way.
Mm-hmm.
And the ripples of that cause hell.
If you look at his actions, that kind of effect that it has on Philip, you see him sort of, he essentially subscribes to the belief system of another church. It's just the Church of Science, and he sort of wraps himself in that. You can see that conversation taking place in the film.
Well, look, there are two, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are two very strong places where one where you see that writ large and one where you hear it. The first one is that remarkable freeze frame of the woman who just believes she's had contact with her son, her dead son, where that's ripped away from her.
Yeah.
And the pain of that's held in front of you, where you're just left thinking, is that better? Even though this is based on a lie, it's no different to the lie of what you're subscribing to. And then the other one is with Father Emery, where they're sitting in the church. And he just, the priest says to him, I'm just so bored of hearing this again and again and again. We really enjoy the debate of this. We spend a lot of our work time just debating this stuff.
What are you up to at the minute, and where can people follow you? Just, is there any channels you would like to check
out? Well, I've got a show that's just opened in the West End called Unbelievable, which I wrote with Darren Brown and Andrew O'Connor, and we directed it. And it's a new way of doing a magic show, and it's had very nice reviews. It's great fun. It's a brilliant night out. That's unbelievablelive.com. I've just finished a film that I'm in. I can't talk about what it is, but that will be out soon. And I will be doing a show in the West End next year, which I can't talk about what it is, but that will be out soon.
So we should just keep an eye on your career. That's
what I'm hearing. And then if you haven't seen, I think the last big thing that I did, if you're a crime fan and you don't watch Unforgotten, I did the 4th season, which was a year and a half ago or something. I was very proud of that show. You should also, The Warlock Effect is mine and Jeremy Dyson's novel. If you're a fan of ghost stories, you will love it. We're turning it into a TV series at the moment. We're starting that. But it's also, I do the audio book. It's a thriller set in 1950s Soho about Britain's most popular magician who gets drawn into an espionage plot.
Totally sold. But if everybody would like to follow Andy, as I say, very talented guy. You'll not go wrong with anything he's done. Thanks for coming on. It's been great.
Thanks, Daniel. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Andy, for agreeing to take part in this video. You can catch my full, unedited discussion with Andy where we talk his history with magic, the ideas of ghost stories, his influences in his work, and his filmmaking journey in general over on my Patreon. And with that, that is the third last episode of this Wholesome Halloween season down. And let me tell you, 29 long scripts in at this point, I am starting to get genuinely shocked it has gotten this far. I didn't know it was going to be this when it began, but this has been the biggest and most expansive one of these marathons yet. And it feels unreal to me that it's seriously starting to come towards an end. But we are not done yet. There's still 2 more to go before we are fully finished. So remember to subscribe to my OnlyDans at the red button below and hit the bell so you don't miss the last 2 episodes. And of course, like if you like the video and comment with your thoughts. But also, before you go, I have some announcements. 2 of them, kinda new ones. So firstly and most importantly, I would super appreciate it if you help us out this month with our big charity goal. As I record this, it's before any episodes are live, so I have no idea what's going on in terms of raising money for Trans Lifeline. I hope it's going well, but regardless of where you're at, you can help out by donating at the donation button on this page or by pre-ordering a charity shirt, which will start printing and shipping once this whole saga wraps up, with 100% of profit going to the charity on top of all of the Patreon income I make this month, as well as any ad revenue for the month too. In non-trans Lifeline efforts, my 2 new announcements are that, first of all, if you're not already part of the Patreon, then you might not know that all patrons this year get 4 exclusive episodes of Wholesome Halloween I am calling Wholesome Halloween 2.5, where I dive into the reboots and remakes of the slasher icons I investigated in Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season. Second new announcement is that I have yet another link to some project I'm working on in the description of this video. I haven't really mentioned this in any of the vids I recorded prior to today, as I wasn't sure if I was far along enough to plug it, and to be honest, I still can't say too much about what I'm doing, but what I can say is that I'm working on a horror game documentary project with some pretty prominent industry figures, and if you like horror games and that sounds like your bag, then please check out the survey in the description to give us your thoughts on what you'd like to see in such a project. I cannot stress how much this would help me out in terms of validating this project to some very important people I'm chatting with, and how much it would be appreciated. Other announcements you've already heard in every other video so far, but I'll go over them once more. If I am still in Face of Horror competition, which is unlikely at this point, but if I am, holy crap, please vote for me and keep me in the running at the link in the description, because that thing is coming to an end soon. And of course, as you all know by this point, I'm now a creative advisor on the latest entry in the juggernaut horror documentary franchise, In Search of Darkness. And as an advisor, I can get you all a 10% discount on it through the link in the description. I apologise that in most videos I said 10% discount code. Jump the gun on that one. Don't have a code. It's literally just a link. I just recorded all of these before I knew how this was going to work, and it's only now that I've realised I'm literally just going to get a link. So if you go to the link in the description, you get your 10% off there. You don't need a code. Just use the link. And if you do use that link, you'll be helping support me, so I appreciate you doing so. Pretty sure that's everything now. So now that we're all totally wrapped up, I think the only thing left to say is I've been Dan Drambles. You're watching Wholesome Halloween 3, A Celebration of Horror, and I will see you again tomorrow.